Cicero, Pro Cloentio, Section 27, Year 2. One charge more is left for me, as such a kind judges, from which you can clearly see that which was said by me at the beginning of my speech. That whatever evil Allus Cloentius saw during those years, whatever anxiety and business he has at this time, has all been concocted by his mother. You allege that Oppianicus was killed by poison, which was given to him in bread through the agency of a certain Marcus Aurelius, a friend of Oppianicus, and this was done through the machination of Habitus. In this matter I ask this, first of all, what reason Habitus had why he should wish to kill Oppianicus? Indeed, I acknowledge that there was enmity between them, but people want their enemies to be killed either because they are afraid or because they hate. By what fear, then, pray, was Habitus induced that he tried to take such a great crime upon himself? What reason was there that anyone should fear Oppianicus, when he had already been punished for his crimes, banished from the city? What did he fear? That he might be attacked by a person who was already ruined, or that he might be accused by a condemned man, or that he might be harmed by the testimony of an exile? Section 27, Part 2. But if, however, Habitus did not want him to enjoy life for the reason that he hated his enemy, was Oppianicus so foolish as to think that what he was living at the time was life, a life of a condemned man, an exile, deserted by everyone, a man whom, because of the wickedness of his character, no one would be willing to receive in his house, approach, speak to, or even look at? Did Habitus then envy this man's life? If he hated this man bitterly and completely, should he not have wanted him to live as long as possible? Was he as an enemy hurrying along this man's death, because it was his only refuge from disaster among calamities? If this man had had any spirit and courage, he himself would have committed suicide, as many brave men often have done in adversity of this kind. Why would an enemy have wanted to offer to this man that which this very man should choose for himself? For indeed, what evil, pray, has death brought upon that man? Unless perchance we are induced by absurdities and stories to think that he is enduring the punishments of the wicked among the gods below, and that he has come across more enemies there than he has left here, and that he has been driven headlong into the dwelling place and area of the wicked by the avenging spirits of his mother-in-law, wives, brothers, and children. If these myths are false, a fact which everyone understands, what else then did death deprive him of, other than the feeling of pain? Section 28. Well then, the poison, by whom was it administered? By Marcus Aurelius. What has this man to do with Habitus? Nothing. Indeed, far from it, since Aurelius was on very friendly terms with Oppianicus, rather there was even enmity. Was Cloentius then likely to entrust both his own crime and the danger to Oppianicus, especially to a man whom he knew was rather hateful to Cloentius, and on very friendly terms with Oppianicus? Then why do you, who were roused by your moral sense of duty, to prosecute, allow this Aurelius to be unpunished for so long? Why do you not use the example of Habitus and have a judgment beforehand about this matter through an investigation of that man who had administered the poison? Well, now then, how unlikely, how unusual, gentlemen of the jury, how novel is that idea, poison given in bread. Could it have been given more easily than in a cup? Was it possible for the poison to have been hidden more widely in some part of the bread than if it had been completely liquefied in a drink? Was it able to flow through into his veins and all parts of his body more quickly if it was eaten rather than drunk down? Was it easier to escape detection in bread, if it had been noticed, than in a cup, when the poison was so mixed up in such a way that in no way could it be distinguished? But, you will say, he died of a sudden death. But if this had happened in this way, nevertheless, that event, on account of this kind of death in the case of many people, would not have a sufficiently strong suspicion of poison. If it was suspicious, it would nevertheless apply to other people rather than to Habitus. But in that very matter, people are lying most shamefully. Learn now, so that you may understand about the matter, both his death and how, after the death, an accusation against Habitus was sought by his mother. Section 29. While he was wandering, a vagrant and exile, and shut out from everywhere, Oppianicus had made his way to Lucius Quinctius in the Falernian district. There he first met with the disease and was quite severely ill, and for a long time. Since Cicero was with him, and she associated with a certain Sextus Attius, a farmer and a powerful man who was usually with her, on more familiar terms than the very profligate husband could put up with. Even if his condition was impaired, a certain Nicostratus, a faithful favourite slave of Oppianicus, very inquisitive and in no way deceitful, is said to have been accustomed to report many things to his master. Meanwhile, since Oppianicus was now recovering and could no longer endure the wickedness of the farmer in the Falernian district, and had set out here to Rome, for he was accustomed to hire some dwelling house outside the gate, he is said to have fallen from his horse, and the fellow, whose health was already weak, heavily struck his side, and after coming to Rome with the fever, he died within a few days. The reason for his death, gentlemen of the jury, was of such a kind that either involves no suspicious circumstances, or if it does, it would involve a domestic crime within the house walls. Section 30. After his death, Sassia, that abominable woman, immediately began to contrive a plot for her son. She decided to hold an inquiry about the death of her husband. She purchased a certain Strato from Aulus Rupilius, whom Oppianicus has used as a doctor, as if to do the same thing as Habitus had done in buying Diogenes. She said she would make an inquiry about this Strato, and about a certain Escala, her slave. Furthermore, she demanded from this young Oppianicus for the inquiry that slave Nicostratus, whom she considered to have been too talkative and too faithful to his master. Since this Oppianicus was a boy at that time, and that inquiry was said to be about his father's death, although he thought that slave was devoted both to him and had been devoted to his father, in no way, however, did he dare to refuse. Many friends and guests of Oppianicus and of the woman herself were summoned, honourable men and distinguished in all respects. The inquiry was held with all the most violent torture methods. Although the feelings of the slaves were tempted by both hope and fear to say something in the inquiry, still, I suppose, having been led by the support of those who had been called, they stuck to the truth and said they did not know anything. Section 31. The inquiry was dismissed on that very day by the judgment of her friends. After a long enough interval they were summoned again. The inquiry was held afresh. No violence of the fiercest tortures was omitted. Those who had been summoned turned away in disgust and could no longer endure it. The cruel and wanton woman was furious that those things which she had planned were by no means turning out for her as she had hoped. Since the torturer and the tortures themselves were now worn out, and yet she was not willing to bring them to an end, one of those who had been summoned, a man who was both distinguished by honours by the people and endowed with the utmost goodness, said that he realized that it was not a question of finding out the truth, but that they might be compelled to say something untrue. When the rest approved this remark, it was decided in accordance with everyone's opinion that it seemed to have been investigated enough. Nicostratus was returned to Oppianicus, She herself set out for Larinum with her servants, grieving because she thought that her son would now certainly be safe, to whom not only did no true charge reach, but not even a false suspicion, and whom, far from an open attack by his enemies, not even the hidden treachery of his mother could have harmed. When she reached Larinum, although she had pretended that she had been persuaded that the poison had been given to her husband by that Strato, she immediately gave him a shop at Larinum, which was furnished and stocked for the sake of practicing medicine. Section 32. For 1 year, another year, and a third year, Sassia remained inactive, so that she seemed to be wishing and praying for some disaster to befall her son, rather than planning and contriving it. Then, in the meantime, in the consulship of Hortensius and Quintus Metellus, in order to detract this Oppianicus, who was doing something else and contemplating nothing of that kind, to this accusation she betrothed her daughter to him against his will, the daughter whom she had conceived of her son-in-law, so that if Oppianicus was tied by marriage at the same time and bound by the hope of the will, she might be able to have him in her power. Roughly at this very time, that Dr. Strato committed burglary at her home, and murder of the following kind. Since there was a chest in her house, in which he knew there was a considerable amount of coins and gold, in the night he killed 2 fellow servants in their sleep, and threw them into the fish pond. He himself cut out the bottom of the chest, and took out sesterces and 5 pounds of gold in weight, with the complicity of one of the slaves, a boy not yet fully grown. When the theft became known the following day, all suspicion was aroused against those slaves who were not present. When that cutting out of the base of the chest was noticed, people began to ask how this could have happened. One of Sassia's friends remembered that he had seen in an auction among the small items that a little crooked saw, with teeth all round and curved, was for sale, by which it seemed that that base could have been cut around in that way. To cut a long story short, a thorough investigation was made of the money collectors. It was discovered that that saw had gone to Strato. When this beginning of suspicion arose, and Strato was openly accused, that complicit boy was greatly afraid. He made the whole matter known to his mistress. The men were found in the fish pond. Strato was thrown into chains, and coins were also found in his shop, but by no means all of them. Now we move to some English sections. A prosecution for theft. Sections 181 to 185. 181. A prosecution for theft is commenced against him. For what else can anyone suspect? Do you say this, that when a chest has been pillaged, money taken, only some of it recovered, and when men had been murdered, that then an investigation into the death of Oppianicus was instituted? Who will you get to believe that? What is there that you could possibly allege? What would be less possible? In the next place, to pass over the other points, was it 3 years after the death of Oppianicus that investigation was made into his death? Yes. And being exasperated on account of her former grudge, she then, without the slightest reason, demanded that same Nicostratus for an examination. Oppianicus at first refused. After she threatened that she would take her daughter away from him and alter her will, he, I will not say brought his most faithful servant to that most cruel woman, for her to subject him to the examination, but he clearly gave him up to her for punishment. Section 182. After 3 years had elapsed, then, the long-projected investigation into the death of her husband was made. And what slaves were involved in the investigation? I suppose some new circumstances were alleged in the accusation. Some new men were involved in the suspicion. Strato and Nicostratus were those mentioned. What? Had not an ample investigation into their conduct taken place at Rome? Was it not so, pray? The woman, now mad, not by disease but with wickedness, though she had conducted an investigation at Rome, though it had been resolved, in accordance with the opinion of Titus Annius, Lucius Rutilius, Publius Saturius, and other most honourable men, that the investigation had been carried far enough. Still, 3 years afterwards, she attempted to institute an investigation into the conduct of the same men, allowing, I will not say no man, lest you should say by chance that one of the inhabitants of the colony was present, but no respectable man to be present, and this investigation was in reality directed against the life of her son. Section 183. Can you say, for it occurs to me to think that what possibly can be said, even if it has not been said as yet, that when the investigation about the robbery was proceeding, Strato made some confession respecting the poison. By this single means, O judges, truth, though kept under the wickedness of many, often raises its head, and the defence which has been cut away from the innocents gets breathing time, either because they who are cunning in devising fraud do not dare to execute all that they devise, or because they whose audacity is conspicuous and prominent are destitute of the craftiness of malice. But if cunning were bold, or audacity crafty, it would scarcely be possible to resist them. Was there no robbery committed? Nothing was more notorious at Larinum. Did no suspicion attach to Strato? On the contrary, he was accused on account of the circumstance of the saw, and he was also informed against by the boy who was his accomplice. Was that not stated in the investigation? Why, what other reason was there for making the investigation at all? Did Strato, then, this is what you are bound to say, and what Cicero was constantly saying at the time, while the investigation was going on about the robbery, while under the torture, make any confession about the poisoning? Section 184. Behold now, here is the case which I have just mentioned. The woman abounds in audacity. She is deficient in contrivance and in ability, for many documents of what came out in the investigation are preserved, which have been read to you and made public, those very documents which he said were then sealed up. And in all these documents there is not one letter about theft. It never once occurred to her to write out the first speech of Strato about the robbery, and after that to add to it some expression about poisoning, which might seem not to have been extracted by any interrogatory, but to have been wrung out from him by pain. The investigation into the robbery was suspended by the suspicion of the poisoning, which was a previous subject for investigation, which this very woman herself had pointed out, who, after she had come to the resolution, being compelled thereto by the opinion of her friends, that the examination had been pushed far enough, for 3 years afterwards loved that man Strato above all the other slaves, and held him in the greatest honour, and loaded him with all sorts of kindness. Section 185. When, therefore, the investigation into a robbery was going on, and that robbery too which he, beyond dispute, had committed, did he then abstain from saying a word about that which was the subject of the investigation, but at once say something about the poisoning? And did he never say one word at all about the robbery, even if not at the time when he ought to have said it still, either at the end or middle, at any part whatever of his examination? Section 35. Back to Latin. Now you see, judges, that wicked woman composed this falsified record of the inquiry with the same hand with which, if the power were given, she would desire to kill her son. Moreover, tell me who signed and sealed that very record of the inquiry. Name any one person. You will find no one, except a man of that sort whom I would prefer to be brought forward rather than for no one to be named. What do you say, Titus Accius? Will you introduce into the court a capital charge, proof of crime, the fortunes of another person composed in letters, and not name the author of that document, nor the person who sealed it, nor any witnesses? Will these men of this caliber approve the type of destruction which you have brought from this mother's breast upon this most innocent son? So be it. There is no weight in the records. What was done about these fellows, Strato and Nicostratus? I am asking you, Ophianicus, what are you saying was done about your slave Nicostratus? The fellow whom, since you were going to accuse him within a short time, you should have escorted to Rome, given the opportunity to give evidence, in short, to keep unharmed for the inquiry. Keep for these judges, keep for this occasion. For indeed, judges, I have to inform you that Strato was put on the cross after his tongue was cut out. There is not one of the citizens of Larinum who does not know this. The woman, in her madness, was afraid neither of her guilty conscience, nor the hatred of her fellow townsfolk, nor her reputation in the eyes of everyone. But as if everyone would be witness of her future wickedness, she feared only to the extent that she might be condemned by the last words of a dying slave. Section 36. What monstrosity is this? What monster, ye gods, was there as great in what other places? What crime so dangerous and enormous, or where shall we say it was born? For now, judges, you certainly see that it is not without the greatest reasons of necessity that I have spoken about the mother at the beginning of my speech. For there is no evil, no wickedness, which from the very beginning she did not wish for her son. Pray for, contemplate, carry out. Nothing has been planned by Ophianicus without the woman's advice. If this had not been the case, certainly later, when the plot was detected, she would not have left as if from a wicked husband, but rather she would have fled as if from a very cruel enemy, would have left that house overflowing with every sort of wickedness forever. Far from doing this, from that time onwards she missed no opportunity to arrange some plot, and every day and night the mother missed no opportunity wholeheartedly to plan the destruction of her son. First of all, in order to establish that Ophianicus as accuser against her own son, she bound him with gifts, services, marriage to her daughter, and hope of an inheritance. Section 36, continued. Not only was she careful in this matter alone, namely to prepare an accuser against her son, but she also planned with what matters she might equip him. For this reason arose those attentions to the slaves, by means of both threats and promises. From this reason arose those endless and most cruel inquiries about the death of Ophianicus, an end to which was finally brought about not by the restraint of the woman, but by the prestige of friends. As a result of this same wickedness, those trials were held. As a result of this same wickedness, those trials were held at Larinum 3 years later, indicative of the same madness of the false records of the inquiries. Arising out of that same frenzy also was the depraved cutting out of the tongue. Finally, the organization of this whole accusation was thought up and embellished by that woman.
Sorry, Betty.
That's all right.
Give me an ice cream.
There might be another freezer.
You not got any ice cream?
And embellished by that woman. And so, when she had sent the accuser of her son, fitted out with this ammunition, to Rome, she herself delayed for a short time at Larinum, for the sake of procuring and hiring witnesses. Later, however, when the news was brought to her that this man's case was approaching, she hastily flew here, so that neither diligence was lacking for the prosecutors nor money for the witnesses. Or perhaps so that the mother did not miss out on this sight most wished for by her, of Habitus's mourning and grief, and such unkempt clothing. Section 37. But now, what do you think that woman's journey to Rome was? I have heard and found out about it from many sources, because of my nearness to the people of Aquinum and Fabritaria. What gatherings there were in these towns, what groans of both men and women were made, to think that a certain woman was there from Larinum, and she was making a journey right from the upper sea to Rome, with a large retinue and money, so that she may be able more easily to cheat and crush her son with a capital charge. There was not one of them, I may say, almost no one, who did not think that the place should be purified. Wherever that woman had journeyed, there was not one of them who did not think that the earth itself, which is the mother of all, was being desecrated by the footprints of the depraved mother. Therefore, she had no opportunity of stopping in any town. Not one was found. Out of so many innkeepers who did not flee from the pollution of her glance, she was entrusting herself to darkness and solitude rather than to either any city or innkeeper. But at this very moment, which of us does she think does not know what she is up to, what she is contriving, what in short she thinks every day? We know whom she entreated, to whom she promised money, whose loyalty she tried to undermine with a bribe. Indeed, moreover, we know all about the nightly sacrifices, which she thinks are so secret, and her wicked prayers and accursed vows, by which she even calls the immortal gods as witness to her wickedness. But she does not understand that the minds of the gods are able to be appeased by devotion to duty, religious awe and upright prayers, not by polluted superstition, nor by sacrificial victims slaughtered in order to accomplish a crime. I believe that the immortal gods have rejected her raging cruelty from their altars and temples. That is the end of Cicero Pro Cluentio, Year 2.